Welcome, dear students. I'm going to talk about the increasing ignorance of French during the 15th century. I hope and expect that after the completion of this topic, you would be able to understand how the rise of English and increasing ignorance of French in the 15th century took place and what were the circumstances that led towards that. Well, my dear students, the writers of the beginning of the 14th century asserted, they made claims that they had seen many nobles who could not speak French. French was associated with, it was linked with, it was connected with nobility. But during, the 14th century, particularly towards the beginning of the 14th century, we find certain evidence that certain writers made claims that many people from this nobility could not speak French. By the 15th century, situation had already started changing. Speaking French fluently was considered to be an accomplishment. Now, because this was not an everyday task, now it was not in usage. People would not use it for everyday conversations. Naturally, French started losing its prestige, and it also started losing, its fluency amongst its speakers. So it would be considered to be a task. It would be considered to be an accomplishment if somebody could really speak French fluently. Not only speaking, but also during the 15th century, we find evidence that the use of French in writing lessened. It always starts, the shift starts with the spoken language. Then it moves on towards the written language, and same happened here. In the year 1400, George Dunbar, who was the Earl of March, wrote to the king in English language. Now, this is very important. Nobility talking to nobility, royalty talking to royalty, generally they would use French language. And the precedence before was of the use of French. But now, this particular Earl, he wrote to the King of England in English language. And what did he write? I'm quoting here. "And, noble prince, marvel ye not that I write my letters in English, for that is more clear to my understanding than Latin or French." We have many other instances in the history that prove the same point. Here is another case that I'd like to share. This is a letter from Richard Kingston, who was the Dean of Windsor, and he addressed the king in 1403. In his letter, he starts bravely, I would say bravely enough, in French, because that was the custom, that was also the precedence. However, because by that time it was not natural to use French, so, towards the end of the letter, he shifted to English language, and he found it easier, and he found it as a more frank expression to express what he wanted to express. My dear students, an incident that occurred in 1404 seems at first sight to offer an extreme case of, this linguistic situation. The King of France had refused to recognize Henry IV when he seized the English throne. Finally, an attempt was made to settle the matter in the court through negotiations. In negotiations, the English ambassadors complained about the use of French. Now, this is very interesting. Those who were pleading the case of the King of England, the English ambassadors, they did not know enough French. They found it hard to understand that, and that they complained that it should not be used in those negotiations. They not only asked for the use of Latin for speaking, but also for writing. In fact, twice during those negotiations, they said French is a language to them that is as unknown as Hebrew. Before mid-15th century, it was necessary to have a secretary in the French language. You know, this was how the processes and the procedures and the decorum of the government administration and officials would take place, having a French secretary. But from the mid of 15th century, the situation changed, and now the custom was revised. And now the government officials would not have French secretaries because there was no need for them. There would be very, very less people who would use French. By the end of this century, that is the 15th century, the situation was so much different now that Caxton could write, and I'm quoting here, "For the most quantity of people understand not Latin, not French, here in this noble realm of England." Well, I hope you would have noticed that the pronunciation, though I have brought it closer to the pronunciation of modern English for your comfort, the representation of that pronunciation here is in English that is not easy to read. Overall, what I can say is that in the 15th century, French lost its popularity. It was not in currency anymore. It was not being used by the masses, of course, and it was very less frequently being used by the upper class people or by the nobility. Ignorance of French language became common during this period, which automatically and naturally led towards an increase in the popularity of English language.